The letter arrives at the dealership on a Monday morning in the second week of November, delivered by certified mail, in the way that letters arrive when the person sending them wants confirmation that the letter was received, and wants a record of that confirmation that exists independently of any subsequent disagreement about whether communication occurred. The service manager, whose name is Phil Garrett, and who has been running the service department at this dealership for 14 years, signs for the letter at the front desk and takes it to his office and opens it with the particular attention of a man who knows that certified mail from a customer is rarely good news, and who wants to understand what kind of not good news it is before he decides how to respond to it. The letter is from a man named Scott Dempsey. Scott purchased a used Massey Ferguson 5455 from this dealership in the previous March, 8 months before the letter arrives, paying a price that the dealership's used equipment pricing reflected the machine's age, hours, and the inspection that the dealership's technicians conducted before the machine was put on the lot. The letter runs to 4 pages. It describes, in the specific and aggrieved language of a man who has been composing this document in his head for several months before he sat down to write it, a season of mechanical complaints that Scott attributes to the machine's condition at the time of purchase, a condition he characterizes as materially different from what the dealership represented when he bought it. The complaints are specific. The hydraulic system response is described as sluggish from the first weeks of operation in a way that Scott says he reported to the dealership service line twice during the season without receiving a satisfactory response. The engine oil consumption, Scott writes, has been higher than the specification for this model from the first oil change interval, indicating, in Scott's assessment, an engine that was already consuming oil excessively at the time of purchase. The cab climate control system failed in July, leaving Scott to operate in summer heat without the cooling that the system was supposed to provide, and the repair, which Scott paid for at an independent shop because he could not get a timely service appointment at the dealership, cost him $340. The letter concludes with Scott's request, which is a full refund of the purchase price, on the basis that the machine was not in the condition the dealership represented, and that the season's mechanical issues constitute evidence of a pre-existing condition that the dealership either knew about or should have known about at the time of sale. Phil Garrett reads the letter twice. He reads it the second time with a notepad beside him, writing down each specific complaint as Scott has described it: the hydraulic system sluggishness, the oil consumption, the climate control failure, the 2 service line calls, the independent shop repair. He writes these down not because he has already formed an opinion about any of them, but because he is going to need to have an opinion about all of them before he responds. And forming an opinion about a customer's mechanical complaints requires more than reading the customer's account of them. It requires looking at the machine. He pulls the dealership's file on the 5455 from the used inventory records. The pre-sale inspection is documented on 2 pages of the technician's standard inspection form, completed by a technician named Rob, who has been at the dealership for 6 years and whose inspection work Phil considers reliable. The inspection form covers every system that the dealership's pre-sale protocol requires, with pass or flag notations at each line item and a notes section at the bottom where Rob has written 3 items. The first note is that the hydraulic filter was replaced during the pre-sale service and that the fluid showed slight discoloration consistent with normal use on a machine of this age and hours. The second note is that the engine oil consumption was within specification range on the pre-sale compression test, but at the upper end of the acceptable range, a notation that Phil reads with the attention of a man who understands that upper end of acceptable range and lower end of concerning are different descriptions of the same number. The third note is that the cab climate control system was functional on test, but that the compressor showed slightly elevated amperage draw during the operational check. A finding that Rob flagged as a monitor item rather than a replace item, on the basis that the system was functioning correctly and that elevated amperage on an older compressor does not constitute a failure. Phil reads all 3 notes. He sets the file on his desk and calls Rob into his office. The conversation with Rob takes 20 minutes. Rob remembers the 5455. He remembers it because the pre-sale inspection generated the 3 notes that are in the file. And Rob's memory of a machine tends to be organized around the things that required notes rather than around the machines that passed through the inspection cleanly. He stands behind his original assessments on the hydraulic system and the oil consumption, saying that both were within the range that the dealership's pre-sale standard considers acceptable for a machine of the 5455's age and hours. He is slightly less certain in his recollection of the climate control assessment, saying that the elevated amperage draw was a judgment call about whether to flag the compressor for replacement before the sale, and that he made the judgment that the system's correct functionality outweighed the elevated amperage as a signal, a judgment that the compressor's July failure suggests, in retrospect, was perhaps more generous to the lower risk interpretation than the data warranted. Phil thanks Rob and tells him to pull the service records for the 5455, going back to the pre-sale inspection, which Rob does by the end of the afternoon. Phil calls Scott Dempsey on Tuesday morning. The call is brief, not because Phil has nothing to say, but because what Phil has to say requires the machine in front of him rather than a phone conversation about a machine neither man can see during the conversation. He tells Scott that he has received the letter and read it carefully and that he would like to bring the 5455 into the dealership's service department for a thorough inspection before the dealership forms a response to Scott's request. He tells Scott that the inspection will be conducted at the dealership's expense, regardless of what it finds, and that Scott will receive the full technician's report from the inspection before any discussion about the refund request or any other resolution takes place. Scott asks how long the inspection will take. Phil says 2 days. Scott is quiet for a moment and then says he will bring the machine in on Thursday. The 5455 arrives Thursday morning on Scott's trailer, which tells Phil something before the machine comes off the trailer, which is that the machine drove onto the trailer under its own power to get here, which means it is running, which means the complaints that brought it here are not complaints about a machine that stopped working, but complaints about a machine that worked in ways that did not satisfy the man operating it. Phil does not say this to Scott. He says good morning and thanks Scott for bringing the machine in and tells him that the inspection will be complete by end of business Friday and that he will call Scott with the results. Scott nods and unhooks the trailer and drives away, and Phil goes to find Rob and the second technician who will work the inspection, whose name is Danny, and who is newer to the dealership, but whose diagnostic skills Phil considers better than average for his experience level. Rob and Danny spend Thursday afternoon and all of Friday going through the 5455 with the systematic attention that a machine brought in under dispute deserves, which is more thorough than a standard service inspection and more documented, because every finding needs to be recorded in a way that can be explained to a customer who is primed to dispute whatever the inspection finds. They begin with the engine, checking the compression on all 4 cylinders, checking the oil consumption rate against the quantity of oil in the system relative to the last oil change date that Scott can provide, and doing a borescope inspection of the cylinder bores to assess the condition of the bore surface and the ring sealing. The compression numbers are slightly lower than the pre-sale numbers in Rob's inspection record, a decline that is consistent with the hours the machine has accumulated across 1 season of operation, and not inconsistent with the upper end of acceptable oil consumption that Rob noted at the pre-sale. The borescope shows cylinder bore glazing on 2 cylinders, a condition that develops when an engine is operated repeatedly under light load conditions that do not generate sufficient combustion pressure to keep the piston rings fully seated against the bore, allowing oil to pass the rings in small quantities that accumulate into the above specification oil consumption that Scott has observed. Cylinder bore glazing is a finding with a specific cause. It is not a pre-existing condition in the sense of damage that was present before the sale and concealed from the buyer. It is a condition that develops during operation in specific operating patterns and that the pre-sale inspection cannot identify because it does not exist at the time of the inspection. What the pre-sale compression test found was an engine at the upper end of acceptable compression, which is the engine in the condition it was in before one season of operating patterns that were either appropriate or inappropriate for maintaining that compression level, and determining which of those it was requires knowing something about how Scott operated the machine across the season that the compression test alone cannot tell. Danny checks the hydraulic system with a pressure gauge and flow meter rather than the operational feel assessment that Scott's complaint describes as sluggish. The pressure and flow numbers are at the lower end of the specification range, but within it, which is a finding that is simultaneously accurate and incomplete, because a hydraulic system that is at the lower end of specification pressure can feel sluggish to an operator who has reference experience with a system at the middle or upper end of the same specification. And a first-time equipment buyer whose only reference is the machine he purchased has no such comparative reference to know whether what he is experiencing is specification normal or specification low. The hydraulic pump shows wear consistent with a machine of this age and hours, where the pre-sale filter replacement and fluid service did not eliminate because filter replacement and fluid service address contamination rather than mechanical wear on pump components. The pump is within specification. It is at the worn end of within specification. The climate control system assessment confirms what Rob's pre-sale note suggested and what the July failure demonstrated, which is that the compressor was approaching the end of its service life at the time of the pre-sale inspection, and that the elevated amperage draw, Rob noted, was an early indicator of that approach, rather than a stable condition that monitoring would safely manage. The replacement compressor that Scott had installed at the independent shop in July is visible in the system. Danny checks the installation and finds it correct. The system is functioning normally with the replacement compressor. Phil looks at the climate control finding for a long time when Danny presents it to him Friday afternoon. The elevated amperage draw was in the pre-sale notes. The compressor failed 4 months after the sale. The causal connection between the pre-sale finding and the in-season failure is not a certainty. Compressors fail for reasons beyond the ones that elevated amperage predicts, but it is a connection that Phil cannot honestly say is not there. Phil calls Scott Friday evening and tells him the inspection is complete and asks him to come in Monday morning to go through the results. Scott arrives Monday morning at 8 o'clock with the posture of a man who has spent the weekend preparing for a confrontation and who is ready to defend his position against whatever the dealership's inspection found that contradicts it. Phil puts the inspection report on the table between them, both copies, one for each man, and walks Scott through every finding in the order the technicians documented them. He does not editorialize. He reads the findings and explains what each one means in plain language and waits for Scott's questions before moving to the next item. Scott asks several questions, some of them technical and some of them rhetorical, in the way that questions become rhetorical when the person asking them already knows the answer they want and is checking whether the answer they are getting matches it. Phil answers all of them the same way, which is directly and specifically and without the defensive qualification that would signal to Scott that the dealership is protecting a position rather than presenting findings. When they have gone through all of the findings, Phil sets down his copy of the report and says what he has been deciding how to say since Friday afternoon when Danny presented the results. He says that the inspection found conditions in 3 systems that are consistent with Scott's complaints, and that in one of those systems, the climate control, there is a pre-sale notation in the technician's inspection record that connects to the in-season failure in a way that Phil cannot in good conscience characterize as unrelated. He says that the pre-sale notation was a judgment call by the technician, a call that the compressor's July failure suggests was made at the more optimistic end of the available interpretations, and that the dealership bears some responsibility for the consequence of that call, even though the call was made in good faith based on the information available at the time of the inspection. He says he is not going to offer Scott a full refund of the purchase price because the inspection findings do not support a conclusion that the machine was materially misrepresented at the time of sale in the way that Scott's letter characterizes. He says that the hydraulic system and the engine conditions are within specification findings on a used machine of known age and hours that was sold with documentation of those findings, and that operating patterns during the season are a factor in the engine's current condition that the dealership cannot accept full responsibility for. Then Phil says the part that surprises Scott, which is apparent from the change in Scott's posture, from the defensive forward lean of a man waiting for a position to push back against, to the stillness of a man processing something he did not expect to hear. Phil says that the dealership will reimburse Scott the $340 he paid the independent shop for the climate control repair, without qualification, and without requiring Scott to accept any characterization of the situation in exchange for the reimbursement. He says the dealership will also service the hydraulic system at no charge, bringing the pump output to the middle of the specification range rather than the lower end where it currently sits, and that this service will include a hydraulic fluid flush and a pump adjustment that the dealership service protocol allows on this pump model. He says the engine glazing is addressable through a specific operating protocol that Danny has written out and that Phil will give Scott before he leaves. A protocol of extended warm-up periods and higher load operation that allows glazed cylinder bores to partially recover their ring seating without a mechanical intervention. A protocol that costs Scott nothing but operating attention. He says the dealership is not offering these things because the inspection established that the dealership was at fault in the way Scott's letter alleged. He says the dealership is offering them because one of the 3 complaints has a pre-sale connection that Phil considers his department's responsibility, because the other 2 complaints are real experiences that a first-time equipment buyer had with a machine the dealership sold him, and that the dealership has the service capacity to improve, and because the right response to a customer who had a difficult first season is not to present findings that technically exonerate the dealership and send him home. Scott is quiet for a moment after Phil finishes. The confrontational posture that he brought into the room is not present in the same form. He asks Phil one question, which is why the dealership is doing this if the inspection did not find what Scott's letter claimed. Phil says because the inspection found enough to act on, and because acting on what is found is what a service department is for. Scott nods slowly. He does not say thank you in the immediate way of someone who has received something they expected to have to fight for. He says he appreciates it, which is a different thing, and which Phil accepts as the appropriate response from a man who came in ready for a dispute and is leaving with something more useful than a dispute would have produced. The hydraulic service takes Danny 3 hours on Tuesday. The system pressure output improves to the middle of the specification range, which is a measurable difference from the lower end reading the inspection found, and which Scott will be able to feel in the machine's response when he operates it the following season. The reimbursement check for the climate control repair is ready when Scott picks up the machine Wednesday morning. He folds it and puts it in his shirt pocket without looking at it and loads the 5455 on his trailer and drives away. Phil watches the trailer leave from the service bay door and goes back inside to write the service notes for the file, which he does with the same factual specificity that Rob used on the pre-sale inspection, because the notes in the file are the record of what happened and what was done about it, and Phil does not write notes with any other purpose than that one. Rob asks Phil at the end of the week how the Scott Dempsey situation resolved. Phil tells him what happened, the findings, the reimbursement, the hydraulic service, the engine protocol. Rob listens and then says that the climate control call was his, and that he understands if Phil wants to document it differently in the pre-sale inspection protocol going forward. Phil says he already has, that the updated protocol now designates elevated compressor amperage draw as a replace before sale item rather than a monitor item, that the threshold for making that call has been moved to a more conservative position that the Dempsey situation justified moving it to. Rob nods. He asks whether the change applies to the current lot inventory as well. Phil says it does, that he wants Rob to go through the used lot and flag any climate control systems showing the pattern the 5455 showed before the pre-sale and address them before those machines go to buyers. Rob says he will start the following Monday. Phil says start Friday. Rob says he will start Friday. Scott Dempsey calls the dealership the following April, which is the spring before his second season with the 5455. He asks for a service appointment for the pre-season inspection, specifying that he would like Danny to do the work, because Danny explained the engine glazing protocol clearly, and Scott wants to ask him some follow-up questions about what the first season of following it has produced. The appointment is scheduled. Danny does the inspection. The compression numbers on the engine are slightly better than the November inspection found, which is not a dramatic improvement, but is the direction that the glazing recovery protocol produces when it is followed correctly, and Scott has followed it correctly, which Danny confirms from the compression data and from the bore condition visible on the bore scope. Danny tells Scott this directly, that the protocol worked and that the engine's trend line is moving in the right direction, and that another season of the same operating discipline should continue the improvement. Scott asks what he should watch for that would indicate the protocol is not working. Danny tells him specifically and writes it down on the inspection sheet so Scott has it in writing rather than in memory. Scott takes the sheet and puts it with the preseason paperwork he keeps in the cab document holder that every Massey Ferguson of this model has above the right side window, where the operator's manual and the parts reference and the seasonal notes live in the particular organization of a man who has learned, across one difficult season and one honest conversation with a service manager, that knowing your machine and knowing what to watch for are not things that come with the purchase. They are things that come with the attention you pay after the purchase, season by season, in the particular way that a working relationship with a piece of equipment develops between a man and a machine when both of them are given what they need to do the job correctly.